At the start of August, my YouTube feed showed me an animation challenge, and the theme was boss fight. So, I spent the next 30 days putting together the best 5 seconds of animation I could manage. Of course, it had to be Terraria themed, so let's dive right into it. I started recording my process a bit late here, but my plan was to create a Previs version of the animation to use as a template to easily test out ideas and sort of create a blueprint for what the final would be, just using quickly thrown together assets as a representation for what they'd be later. It's a pretty common practice, and it really helps hone in on an idea before putting all the time into making it look good. I also put together a quick reference sheet with images and artwork to use as inspiration. For the contest, we're given a camera that we can't modify at all, but our job is to pretty much make everything else. I decided on a standoff between a wizard and the Moonlord, with the wizard using the last prism, and at the end the beam of the Moonlord and the last prism would collide in slow motion. I didn't quite recreate exactly how the last prism works in game. I made it more so to shoot out a singular beam, since that was sort of the only way I could get the idea to work. And once I got a pass out, I shared it with my coworker, who gave me some other great ideas to add to it, the main one being the trees kind of exploding. And after some more animating and experimenting with different options, I could finally get moving on the final, since I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted, and I knew a lot of work was ahead of me. Step 1 was the Moonlord. I started with a generic muscular man that I chopped the legs off of, and then just started blocking in all the basic forms. I added in the major parts without focusing too much on just one, but the tentacles, the eyelids, the brain, the hand, eyelids, the spine. The Moonlord has kind of weird anatomy, so I tried to find a balance between his design and making it feel realistic. I used a lot of downloaded assets also to help me with this. I bought a brain and I bought a spine model, and I just used those as a base, which saved me a lot of time. Once all of his parts were sort of in place, then I merged his tentacles and his eyelids to the body and started kind of refining the sculpt. I spent most of my effort on the face and the hands and pretty much worked on those till I was happy. Then I added in some teeth, some gums, and when that was done I felt it was good enough to re-topologize. Once the topology on the final model was ready, I could now finally kind of refine the sculpt. I brought it into Maya to UV since that was a bit easier for me, then brought it back into ZBrush to do a final details pass, which was actually a lot of fun. Because I bought some cool brush packs for alien skin and some other creature stuff that did a ton of the heavy lifting for me at this stage. At this point, I was pretty happy in general. I did some final adjustments. I added in another layer of teeth just because I thought it looked cooler. I sculpted the eye to add some detail to it and some dimensionality. I added in these secondary eyelid tear duct things that are in the Moonlord design that I thought just would kind of add to it, and that was pretty much the whole model. Now it's time to texture this guy. I baked all the high-res details from the sculpt onto the lower-res model and started painting in the major colors. I added lots of layers of grunge and breakup, some color variation around the eyes and the glowing bits on the chest and the tentacles. I know I'm eventually coming back to this to refine the textures once I see them in proper lighting and with the final shaders, so I'm not super worried about making anything perfect right now. I set up the shaders and did some render testing, duplicated the main eye from the head into the hands, and then I was ready to start rigging. To rig this guy, I used a plugin for Maya called mGear. It's a pretty amazing tool. It lets you place guides around your character and will build an advanced rig using those guide placements. I got the arms, fingers, tentacles, and eyes rigged up pretty quick, and I realized I wanted to animate the mouth too, so I put some extra joints in there that I could rotate and it would open the mouth in pretty much whatever direction I wanted. Once that was ready, I bound all the joints to the main skin, and I spent a bunch of time cleaning it up, making sure he kind of moved the way I wanted, making sure the arms bent nicely and the tentacles moved well. It was just kind of going through and moving every control and making sure it looked good. Then I added the teeth to the mouth joints and added some new joints in for the other eyes that would match the main head eye. So whenever I aimed the main eye, the glowing ones would follow. The last part was adding the blink to the eyelids on the head and the hands, which I did with a blend shape, just by sculpting the eyelid closed and setting up a control to blend it. Okay, the Moonlord is done, for now at least, and now to start on the Wizard. I actually bought a character for this to start as a base to make my life a lot easier. I'm not really experienced making awesome flowing clothing like this character has, and I didn't really want to spend the time on it, so it seemed like the right choice, and I think it was. I modified a lot of the clothing though. I spent so much time turning it all into solid cloth pieces so I could easily simulate them since the original model wasn't really built that way. And I made some simple armor on the hands and the feet. I wanted the character to be inspired by Nebula armor, but it was mainly a loose inspiration since I was kind of just working with what I had. I stopped recording at some point until I got to the texturing, but I sort of rushed through the texturing since again, I pretty much always come back to it once the final scene is put together. Then I made a simple rig using Human IK and Maya, which is one of their rigging systems. It was pretty jank though, because I don't really know how to use it, but I think it got the job done. And that's the Wizard. It's finally time to move on to the trees, which I was kind of dreading because I didn't really know how I was going to pull it off. But spoilers, they turned out awesome. I started back in ZBrush creating the main tree branches with the plan to generate the leaves on the branches later. I was going for the stylized realism, so I really needed to have enough detail to look good, but not too much that it'll destroy my PC. I added the other branches along the base and probably added too much detail to the sculpt too early before I knew if it would work or not, because I do actually end up bringing it back in here. I brought it into Maya and I created some test leaves to generate the branches on using a system called Mash. It was sort of working, but it wasn't working great, and I wasn't creating the rounded treetops I was looking for. I experimented with generating longer and more random leaves and branches on the tree before realizing I needed a denser base to get a more uniform shape. So back to ZBrush, I added a bunch of mini branches to the tree to make it denser, then I brought that back into Maya, created a new branch leaf asset that I could generate on the tree, and after playing with the scale and the shape, I was pretty happy with the results. Then I put a simple rig on the tree so I could animate it by hand, and luckily all of the leaves generated on the tree followed the rig fine. I actually wasn't sure if it was going to work, but it did. Unfortunately, it was really performance intensive, and I eventually created a toggle to hide the leaves while animating and could turn them on during render. I just had a generic tree bark texture on the tree for now, and it wasn't really working, so I brought the tree into Substance and I stamped a tree bark texture all over it, and it looked decent enough. I continued to do some refining on the leaves and the rig and eventually had it in a good place to move on. And then I remembered the tree had to break apart. So I created these dense shapes that I sculpted to use as booleans to cut the tree apart. I cut it around the areas where I had a joint so I could toggle between the solid and the broken tree anytime, and I could use the same rig on both. I added some quick material on the inside of the tree, and added a few attributes so I could modify the leaves on each tree individually. Mash comes with a lot of attributes too, and I just connected those to a slider value on the tree controller. I connected a random seed attribute to randomize the generation, I did a size, density, and rotation too, which all ended up being really useful later. Okay, I put everything I made so far into a scene to do some lighting testing, and I immediately went back into Substance and adjusted some of the Moonlord's textures. I also added a mask for subsurface and transmission, and I thought it was looking pretty sweet once I put it all in the shader. It was now time to animate the scene with the final assets. I started with the Moonlord and got most of that in place. Then I posed out the Wizard and placed the trees. I spent a lot of time working on the placement of the trees to work with the camera and the composition. It was a tough balance between having enough trees so it looks like a forest, but not completely losing the Moonlord behind them. I ended up playing with this a lot, and even more towards the end. I created some simple beams out of geometry that I rigged to be able to shoot outwards and added some deformers to it to vary the shape. Then I made some materials for the beam as a baseline, knowing I'd be adding some effects and particles and doing a lot of the editing and comp later to really hone the look in. I blocked in some simple lighting too once the beam was blasted, and it started looking pretty cool. I kept refining the animation, I worked on the pose of the Wizard, started animating the trees, and then I worked on having the Wizard's beam actually hit the Moonlord at the end once the time sort of resumes. I decided I wanted to make a stylized moon rather than my initial plan, which would just be taking a sphere and putting a moon texture on it. And I got that out pretty quick. I downloaded some Crater alphas and just kind of stamped those on there in ZBrush. Then I started animating the trees exploding at the end, which was turning out pretty sweet, but pretty difficult to get working with the slow motion of the scene. And then I did something that was probably a bad idea, but I actually really liked how it looked. We can't technically modify the camera in the shot for the contest, but I wanted to pull the character back closer to the camera so you could see more of the details and get more of a dynamic perspective, while sort of zooming through the forest a little. So instead of moving the camera, I moved the entire ground back, with the trees and the character on it. It was kind of an insane thing to do, and even though I did like how it looked, if I could go back, I probably would have just started the character closer to the camera in the beginning. I was a little afraid of the cloth simulation for the wizard since I barely have any experience doing that. I used Encloth, which is built into Maya, and oh boy was it a long day. Simulating in CG usually just involves pressing play and waiting a few minutes or a few hours until you can see how things look. So not only did I have to do the cloth sim on a fast-moving and relatively dynamic action, but I needed it to work with the slow motion in the scene too. I spent pretty much the entire day experimenting until I nailed a bit of a workflow down. Once I got the first piece of cloth working pretty good enough after messing with the simulation and cloth settings for a while, I cashed out that final animation on the cloth, and then I duplicated it and I slowed it down to a rate of like 0.1. Then I used a blend shape to blend to the slowed cloth during the slow motion moment. I repeated this process for the other two pieces of cloth, and then I created like a ton of corrective blend shapes to fix all the intersections and shapes I didn't really like. I finally had most of the pieces in place. I kept refining the animation and finally added in some lights, which mostly consisted of torches on the trees and the moonlight. The scene was really laggy at this point though. I definitely should have been working with more proxies, especially for the trees and the moonlord, but I decided just to suffer through it. I used rotation values on the leaves for each tree to simulate wind, and it worked pretty amazingly. Then I spent some more time animating and lighting and continuing to put pieces in place. I put this rainbow ramp on the last prism beam as sort of a placeholder, but I ended up sticking with it for the final. I decided to use a system called XGen, which I've used before. It's mostly a hair system to generate a bunch of grass geo all over the ground plane. I used Quixel Megascan grass since it looks so good, but I didn't really know how I was going to animate that much dense grass to flow with the wind. There's a wind modifier you could add to XGen, but all it does for custom geo is pretty much bend it as a static mesh, so you don't get that nice flowy grass look. But I didn't really have any other options in front of me. Unfortunately, this wind modifier just wasn't working right at all. The grass was twitching and flickering, and it was really difficult to make it work. I eventually thought I had it in a good enough place to move on, but it really was never that great. Then I added some red flowers that felt like they matched kind of the Terraria aesthetic, and I hand animated some leaves blowing off the trees, and that was pretty straightforward and looked pretty good. Then I just duplicated the group of animated leaves and copied it to other trees and varied it a little, and it was working for me. I still needed a material for the last prism, so I put together this shader that sort of glows on the edges and has a rainbowy ramp animating on it, and I was pretty happy with that too. I also wanted some trees far off in the background, but I didn't want my computer to die, so I quickly rendered out some images of the trees that I could put on the cards, or just flat planes, in the background to fill that in a little bit. I created some custom little hills in the background to place some of these trees on. I found a pretty cool image of stars I put in the background. I continued to work on materials and lighting. I thought about stepping outside for once this month, but then I decided on working on adding the torches to the trees. I used this cool software called Embergen to create a lot of the effects for this thing. I used pretty much their default fire with some slight modifications to create the flames for the torches, but it didn't really turn out the way I was hoping it would. If I went back, I would have exported out the volume and particles of the simulation, which would have been way more expensive to render, but probably would have looked 1,000 times cooler. I also created some effects for the blasts of magic, which again looked so awesome in Embergen, but I struggled to make it look that awesome in render. I made some simple particle effects for the Moonlord beam to add to the energy of it. I moved on to some render testing, and then I spent some more time in the animation. My last recording was on the 25th of August, and the due date was on the 27th at midnight, so things are getting a little tight now. I retextured the wizard a bit to make the outfit pop a little more. I filled in the background a little, I made some simple little Terraria mushrooms to add to the scene, and then I spent the next 2 days rendering, refining, and compositing. I ended up taking the grass from the first render, the first one without AOVs, and I layered it over this new render, which didn't look great, but at least it didn't look like this. I experimented with some beam effects, rendered out a few different passes to layer on top, like some blast effects, a dust explosion, some volume effects from the moon, and the wizard beam on its own, and I spent every second of the remaining time I had trying to make this thing look as good as possible. I submitted it at like 11 PM about an hour before it was due. And finally, the culmination of a month-long grind is over, and I have these 120 frames to show for it. As for the contest, well, I didn't place top 100. Some of these other entries are actually insane, like seriously inspiring stuff. The faked camera move I did, plus the slow motion being sort of a small part of mine, probably hurt my chances, along with some of the small technical issues like the grass and some of the rendering errors. In the end, knowing I could share this with all of you is really a lot more satisfying than anything, and I really hope you all enjoyed. I'll finish with some more renders of our moon boy. I'm going to put a link to download the model and the rig in the description along with all the textures if anybody wants to play with it or check it out. With that, thank you all for watching.